It was an ordinary Saturday morning in a quiet rural valley in Washington state. The rain had been falling for weeks, the way it so often does in the Pacific Northwest, soaking the green hills and swelling the rivers, but no one thought much of it. Families were at home, some still sleeping, some making breakfast, some going about the small routines of a weekend morning. Across a scattered community of houses nestled in the valley beneath a forested hillside, life was proceeding exactly as it had on countless mornings before. And then, in a matter of seconds, without any warning at all, the entire hillside let go. What happened next was so sudden, so violent, and so complete that it is almost impossible to comprehend. An enormous mass of earth, mud, sand, and debris, an entire face of the hill, broke loose all at once and came roaring down into the valley below. It did not creep. It did not slide slowly. It collapsed and surged forward with terrifying speed. A wall of liquefied earth that swept across the valley floor, across the river, and directly into the neighborhood of homes that sat in its path. In the span of perhaps a minute, an area that had been a peaceful community of houses and roads and yards was buried beneath a vast field of mud, some of it many feet deep, erasing the neighborhood almost entirely from the face of the earth. When it was over, dozens of people were dead, making it the deadliest landslide in the recorded history of the United States. In this video, we are going to tell the story of that catastrophe, of how a hillside in Washington collapsed without warning and buried an entire community, taking dozens of lives in a matter of moments. We will explore why it happened, the hidden geological reality that made that hill so dangerous, and the chilling truth that there was little or no warning before it struck. And most importantly, we will confront the sobering question that hangs over the Pacific Northwest to this day, the question of whether such a disaster could happen again. Because the conditions that produced this tragedy are not unique to one hillside. They exist across a great deal of Washington state, in places where people live today. And understanding this danger may be one of the most important things anyone in the region can do. Stay with me, because this is a story that matters far beyond the valley where it happened. To understand the enormity of what happened, you first have to picture the place as it was before, because it was, by all accounts, an idyllic and peaceful spot. The community sat in a river valley in the northwestern part of the state, the kind of quiet rural area where people go to escape the bustle of the cities, to live close to nature among the forests and the mountains. A river wound through the valley floor, and along its banks and across the flat ground, a scattering of homes had grown up over the years into a small, close-knit neighborhood. Towering above the community, on one side, was a large, steep, forested hillside, green and imposing, the kind of slope that formed the beautiful backdrop to daily life. To the people who lived there, that hillside was simply part of the scenery, a familiar and unremarkable feature of the landscape they called home. They had built their lives in its shadow, raised their families there, watched the seasons turn against its green face. It did not look like a threat. It looked like the Pacific Northwest at its most beautiful, a lush green wall rising above a peaceful valley. But beneath that serene surface, that hillside held a dark and dangerous secret, a geological instability that had been building for a very long time. And that would one day be unleashed with catastrophic force upon the unsuspecting community below. What almost no one in the neighborhood fully appreciated was that this particular hillside had a history. It was not a stranger to sliding. Over the years and decades before the Great Collapse, the slope had moved before, shedding smaller landslides that, while far less deadly, were warnings written into the very ground, signs that the hill was unstable and prone to failure. But those earlier, smaller slides had not destroyed the community, and life had gone on. The danger, though it had shown itself before, had never been enough to drive people away, and so the neighborhood remained, sitting in the path of a hillside that had already demonstrated, more than once, that it could not entirely be trusted. Then came that rain-soaked Saturday morning and the catastrophe that no one saw coming. After weeks of heavy rainfall had thoroughly saturated the ground, the unstable hillside finally reached its breaking point. Without any immediate warning, no dramatic rumble that gave people time to flee, no siren, no alert, the slope gave way. An immense volume of earth and debris detached from the hill and collapsed downward and outward, and what happened in those next moments was almost beyond belief. The failing hillside did not simply tumble down as a pile of dirt and rock. The saturated material behaved almost like a liquid, transforming into a fast-moving flow of mud and debris that surged across the valley with astonishing speed and power. It swept across the river, filling and damming it. It rushed across the valley floor and slammed into the neighborhood, and it kept going, spreading out across an enormous area, engulfing home after home. The sheer distance the debris traveled shocked even the experts who studied it afterward, because the flow reached far beyond what many would have imagined possible, burying ground that people would have assumed was safely out of reach of any landslide from that hill. In the space of about a minute, it was over. Where there had been a neighborhood, there was now a vast, desolate field of mud and shattered debris, in places piled many feet deep. Homes had been swept from their foundations, crushed and buried. The landscape itself had been transformed almost beyond recognition, the river blocked, the road buried, the community obliterated. And beneath that immense expanse of mud lay the victims. Dozens of people who had been going about their ordinary morning and who never had a chance to escape, caught in their homes by a disaster that struck faster than anyone could react. When the final toll was counted, the number of lives lost made it the deadliest landslide event in the history of the United States, a catastrophe of a scale that the country had never before experienced from a single slide. In the aftermath, the valley became the scene of a massive, heartbreaking, and dangerous rescue and recovery effort. Responders, along with countless volunteers, many of them neighbors and community members from the surrounding area, rushed to the scene and threw themselves into the desperate work of searching the vast field of debris for any survivors, and then, as hope faded, for the remains of those who had been lost. The conditions they faced were almost unimaginably difficult and dangerous. The debris field was enormous, a treacherous expanse of deep, unstable mud mixed with the shattered wreckage of homes, splintered wood, twisted metal, and every kind of hazard imaginable. The mud could swallow a person, and the ground was unstable and could shift. Searchers labored in the muck, often by hand, in grueling and emotionally shattering conditions, holding on to the faint hope of finding someone alive while confronting the grim reality of the devastation all around them. It was slow, painstaking, dangerous work, and it stretched on for a long time as the searchers worked to recover everyone who had been lost, so that the families of the victims could have some measure of closure. The response also revealed something profoundly moving about the human spirit in the face of disaster. The community and the wider region rallied around the victims and their families with an outpouring of support, of grief, and of determination. Neighbors helped neighbors. Strangers came to assist. A small rural community, shattered by an unimaginable tragedy, drew together and drew strength from one another and from the broader circle of people who refused to let them face the horror alone. In the darkness of one of the worst disasters the region had ever known, that human solidarity shone as a light, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming loss, people will come together to care for one another. To understand not only what happened, but why, and why it could happen again, we have to look beneath the surface at the geology that made that hillside so dangerous. The disaster was not a random act of nature with no explanation. It was the product of specific conditions. Conditions that combined to create a slope that was, in hindsight, a catastrophe waiting to happen. The fundamental problem lay in the very material the hillside was made of. Much of the terrain in this part of the Pacific Northwest was shaped long ago by the great glaciers of the last ice age, which left behind thick deposits of sediment, of sand, silt, clay, and loose material piled up in the landscape. These glacial deposits can form steep hillsides, but the material itself is often weak and prone to failure, especially when it becomes saturated with water. The hill that collapsed was made largely of this kind of unstable glacial material, a slope built from the loose leavings of ancient ice, waiting for the right conditions to give way. And water was the trigger. The immediate cause of the collapse was the enormous amount of rainfall that had fallen in the weeks before, thoroughly soaking the hillside and filling the spaces within the soil with water. Water is the great enemy of slope stability. When soil becomes saturated, it grows heavier, and the water reduces the friction and strength that hold the material together, making it far more likely to fail and far more likely to flow like a liquid once it does. The prolonged, heavy rain loaded the already weak hillside with water until it could no longer support its own weight, and the slope collapsed. The combination of weak glacial soils and heavy saturating rain was the deadly recipe, and it is a recipe that exists in many other places. There were other factors that likely played a role as well, and they have been the subject of much study and discussion. The way land above and around such slopes is used, including the removal of trees whose roots help bind the soil, can influence how much water reaches a hillside and how stable it remains. In truth, a disaster like this is rarely the result of a single cause. It is the convergence of many factors, geological, hydrological, and human, coming together at the worst possible moment. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this tragedy is the question of warning, because while the collapse itself struck without any immediate alarm, the danger of that hillside was not entirely unknown. As we noted, the slope had a history of landslides, having failed before in smaller events over the years and decades prior. To those who studied such things, this history marked the hill as a known hazard, a place where the ground had proven itself unstable and capable of moving. There had, in fact, been studies and reports over the years that identified the risk associated with this slope, documenting its history of instability and warning in various ways of the potential for a serious landslide. The knowledge that this was a dangerous hillside existed, at least among some experts and in some records, and yet that knowledge did not translate into action that could have prevented the tragedy. The neighborhood remained in the path of the hill. People continued to live, and in some cases to build, in an area that the geological record suggested was at risk. The warnings, such as they were, did not reach the people who most needed to heed them in a form compelling enough to change what happened. This is one of the most painful and important lessons of the disaster. There is often a vast gap between the technical knowledge of a hazard and the awareness and action of the people living in its shadow. A report and a file, a note about historical instability, is not the same as a community understanding, deep in its bones, that the beautiful green hill above their homes could one day come down and bury them. The immediate collapse gave no warning, that is true and terrible. But in a larger sense, the warnings had been there for a long time, written in the history of the slope and in the studies of those who understood the ground. The tragedy was not only that nature struck without notice, but that the deeper danger had been known and yet not acted upon in time. And now we come to the question that should concern everyone who lives in the Pacific Northwest. The question that makes this story so much more than a single terrible event in the past. Could it happen again? The sobering, honest answer is yes. The conditions that produce this catastrophe are not confined to one unlucky hillside. They exist across a great deal of Washington state and the wider region. Remember the recipe. Weak glacial soils, the loose material left behind by the ancient ice, form hillsides throughout the region. Heavy, prolonged rainfall, which saturates those soils and triggers failure, is a defining feature of the Pacific Northwest climate. Put those two together, and you have the potential for landslides across an enormous area. There are countless slopes in Washington built of the same kind of unstable material, and every rainy season brings the water that can set them in motion. Many of these slopes have people living below them, in homes and communities that sit often unknowingly in the potential path of a future slide. The specific hillside that collapsed was not a unique freak of nature. It was one example of a hazard that is widespread. This does not mean that a disaster of that magnitude is imminent everywhere, or that every hillside will fail. Most slopes, most of the time, remain stable. But the potential is real, and it is distributed across the region, which is exactly why the lessons of this catastrophe matter so much. The danger is not a thing of the past, safely contained in one valley and one terrible morning. It is an ongoing reality of living in a landscape shaped by glaciers and soaked by rain. A reality that the people of the region must understand and respect if they are to avoid repeating the tragedy in some other valley, below some other beautiful, deadly hill. It would be a disservice to end this story on a note of pure fear, because the true value of understanding this disaster is that it can help prevent the next one. The lives lost in that valley were not lost in vain if the lessons of the catastrophe are learned and acted upon, and there is much that can be done to reduce the danger for the future. The most important lesson is the value of taking hazard knowledge seriously. When experts identify a slope as dangerous, when the geological record shows a history of instability, that knowledge must be translated into real awareness and real action, into careful decisions about where people build and live, and into honest communication of the risk to the communities involved. Improved mapping and study of unstable slopes can help identify the most dangerous places before disaster strikes. Monitoring can, in some cases, detect the subtle signs of a slope beginning to move. And wiser choices about development, about not placing homes and communities directly in the path of known hazards, can keep people out of harm's way in the first place. For individuals living in the region, awareness is the first and most powerful tool. Understanding whether you live below a steep slope of the kind that can fail, being especially alert during and after periods of prolonged heavy rain, knowing the warning signs that a slope may be moving, such as new cracks in the ground, tilting trees, or unusual sounds, and being ready to leave if danger threatens, can all make a difference. The collapse that buried the community struck without immediate warning, but a general awareness of the risk and a healthy respect for the danger of saturated hillsides is a form of preparedness that everyone in landslide country can cultivate. In the end, the story of the deadliest landslide in the nation's history is a story of a beautiful landscape that concealed a deadly danger, of a community that never saw it coming, and of the terrible price paid when a known hazard was not enough respected. But it is also a story that can teach, that can warn, and that can save lives if we let it. The hills of Washington are still standing, still green and beautiful above the valleys where people live, and most of them will never fall. But some of them can, and the memory of that rain-soaked morning is a solemn reminder to understand the ground beneath our feet, to respect the power of water and weak soil, and to never again assume that a quiet hillside cannot, in a